of sounding like a cartoon mouse. It didn't win him many friends. "Let's go check out the old pizzeria." Cyril mimicked Greg's suggestion. Yeah, this was a great idea. It was a crisp autumn night, and the seaside town was dark, robbed of power by the latest storm's assault. Greg and his friends had planned a Saturday night of gaming and junk food, but as soon as the power went out, Hattie's parents tried to recruit them for a board game, the family's tradition during power outages. Hattie had convinced his parents to let the boys bike the short distance to Greg's house, where they could play one of Greg's new tabletop strategy games instead. But once there, Greg enlisted them to go to the pizzeria. For days, he'd known he had to do this. It was like he was drawn to this place. Or maybe he had it all wrong. This could be a wild goose chase. Greg shined his flashlight around the corridor. They just explored the kitchen of the abandoned restaurant and had been shocked to find it was still stocked with pots, pans, and dishes. Who closed a pizzeria and left all that stuff behind? After they left the kitchen, they found themselves next to a large stage at one end of what had once been the main eating area of the derelict pizzeria. A heavy black curtain at the back of the stage was drawn closed. None of the boys had volunteered to see what was behind the curtain, and none of them had mentioned seeing the curtain move when they passed the stage. Hardy laughed again. "Better than hanging with the fam. Hey, what's that?" "What's what?" Cyril aimed his light in the direction of Hattie's gaze. Greg turned his flashlight that way too, toward the far corner of the large, table-filled room they stood in. The glowing beam landed on a row of hulking shapes lined up along a murky glass counter. Bright eyes reflected the light back at them from across the room. "Cool," Hattie said, kicking aside a broken table leg as he made his way toward the counter. Maybe, Greg thought, frowning at the eyes. One pair seemed to be staring right at him. Despite the confidence he'd felt before, he was beginning to wonder what exactly he was doing here. Hattie approached the counter first. "This is dope." He reached for something and sneezed when dust billowed up from the stand. Before they left his house, Greg had suggested they all take handkerchiefs to cover their noses and mouths, but he couldn't find any. He expected to find the empty restaurant filled with dust, mold, mildew, and who knew what else. Surprisingly, given the wet coastal climate, the only decay they'd seen was dust. But there was a lot of dust. Greg stepped around an overturned metal chair and past Cyril, who had his back pressed to a dirty, paint-peeled pillar in the middle of the dining area. Other than one broken table and two upside-down chairs, the area looked like it just needed a heavy cleaning before it could be fit for diners. Which again was strange. Greg had known something would be here, but he didn't expect the building to still hold dishes and furniture and what else? Greg looked at what Hattie held, and he sucked in his breath. Was this what he'd come for? Was this why the old place was calling to him? "What is it?" Cyril asked, not moving any closer to the counter. "I think it's a cat." Hattie turned the lumpy, roughly furred object he held. "Or maybe a ferret." He poked at whatever it was. Might be an animatronic. He put it down and shined his light over the other shapes along the counter. "Yeah, awesome. The prizes, see?" Hattie scanned his light over the stiff figures. That explained the cave-like cubbyholes that lined the broad hallway Greg and his friends had come through to get to the dining area. The little enclosures must have been for arcade cabinets and game booths. I can't believe these are still here, Hattie said. Yeah, Greg frowned, studying what looked like a stiffened sea otter and a tangled octopus. Why were they still here? The old pizzeria had stood, boarded up, and bombarded by coastal storms and sea air for who knew how long. The structure was clearly abandoned, and it looked not just old, but ancient, on the verge of collapse. The graying, weathered siding was so faded you could barely tell what it was. The name of the pizzeria was long gone. So why did it look so good on the inside? Well, not good exactly. But from where Greg stood, the building looked steady enough to stand another 100 years. Greg and his parents had moved to the small town when he was in first grade, so he knew the place well. But he didn't really understand it. For example, he'd always thought it was strange that a boarded-up pizzeria had been left untouched in what was supposed to be a vacation spot. But then again, this wasn't exactly a swanky resort town. Greg's mom called it a hodgepodge. Big, fancy homes could be found across the street, from tiny, ugly beach cabins draped in dirty fishing floats and surrounded by piles of old lumber or crumbled lawn furniture. The house across from Greg's had a huge, boxy sedan, like from the 70s, up on blocks in the front yard. Still, Greg wondered why a pizza place couldn't be turned into something useful instead of being left a gnarled old ghost building that practically screamed break-in to local kids. But weirdly, it didn't look like anyone had broken in before Greg and Cyril and Hattie did. Greg had figured they'd find footprints, trash, graffiti, evidence that other explorers had been here before them. But nothing. It was like the place was abandoned, dipped in formaldehyde, and preserved until Greg suddenly felt like he was supposed to come here. I bet these are still here because they're the really good prizes, Hattie said. No one ever wins the good prizes, Sarah piped up. He had edged a little closer to the counter, but he was still several feet away. There aren't any clowns, Cyril. Greg had to assure Cyril there wouldn't be any clowns in an abandoned restaurant in order to convince Cyril to come along. Not that Greg knew one way or the other. What's that one? Sarah pointed at a large-headed figure with a big nose. It sat under a sign that read, Top Prize. Greg picked it up before Hattie could. It was heavy, and its fur felt matted and coarse. He was oddly drawn to the animal, whatever it was. He studied the pointed ears, sloped forehead, long snout, and piercing yellow eyes. Then he noticed the blue collar around the animal's neck. Something gleaming dangled from the collar. A dog tag? He lifted it. Fetch. Hattie read over Greg's shoulder. It's a dog named Fetch. Greg loved dogs, for the most part, but he hoped to never see one like this one in real life. He held the dog up and tended this way and that. Even the vicious old dog that lived next door to Greg wasn't this ugly. Fetch looked like someone had crossed the big bad wolf with a shark from Jaws. His, surely it was a he, head was a triangle, pointy on top and with a mouth far too wide for comfort at the bottom. Fetch's fur, which looked grayish-brown in the splotchy glow of the flashlights, was missing in places, revealing tarnished metal beneath. A couple of wires stuck out of the big ears, and a partially exposed cavity in Fetch's belly revealed what looked like a primitive circuit board. Look at this. Cyril was, surprisingly now, interested in the counter. He picked up a small booklet inside a plastic sheath. I think it's the instructions. Let me see. Greg plucked the booklet from Cyril's grasp. Hey! Cyril squeaked. Greg ignored his protests. This could be it. Pushing Fetch back on the counter, he pulled the booklet from the plastic and scanned through the instructions. Hattie read over his shoulder. Cyril stuck his head between Greg's chest and the booklet, forcing Greg to hold the booklet farther out. Fetch, the instructions explained, was an animatronic dog designed to sync up with your phone and retrieve information and other things for you. That's lit, Hattie said. Think it still works? How long has this place been empty? Greg asked. Fetch looks like he's older than my dad, but smartphones haven't been around that long. Hattie shrugged. Greg finally did too, and he began poking around Fetch to find the control panel. Hattie and Cyril lost interest. It isn't going to work. It's older tech. It won't be compatible with our phones, Cyril said, cringing, when the wind surged against the building again. Greg felt a chill settle down his spine. Whether it was related to the wind's eerie onslaught or something else, he wasn't sure. Greg returned his attention to Fetch. He wanted to see if he could get the dog thing to do whatever it was supposed to do. He had a hunch this might be what he'd felt in the field, what had called him here. Cyril's pessimism about Fetch didn't surprise Greg. He wouldn't know an opportunity if it thumped him between the eyes. Hattie, on the other hand, was relentlessly positive. He had such a sunny disposition, he pulled off what Greg thought was nothing less than a magic trick. Hattie was accepted by the popular crowd, despite having spent most of his time with Greg and Cyril, two of the nerdiest kids in the school. Maybe it had something to do with his looks. Greg had had girls talking about Hattie. Hattie was either fine, hot, cute, sharp, or just, depending on the girl who was talking. Hattie wandered away from the counter, and Cyril plopped down in a chair at the nearest table. I think we should go, he said. Nah. Hattie brushed him off. There's still a lot to check out. Greg ignored them both. He'd picked up Fetch and found a panel under Fetch's belly. Juggling the instructions, Fetch and his flashlight, Greg bit his lip and concentrated on hitting the right buttons in the right sequence. For an instant, the wind and rain let up, leaving the building in a silence that felt almost menacing. Greg glanced up at the ceiling. He noticed a large stain above his head. A water stain. Distracted from his task for a second, he shined his light over the whole ceiling. No other stains. In fact, why wasn't the whole inside of the restaurant dripping? He thought he'd seen part of the metal roof missing when he'd first looked at the building. Why wasn't it leaking? Shrugging, he returned his attention to Fetch. At this point, he was just randomly pushing buttons. None of the sequences laid out in the instructions were doing anything. As abruptly as it had stopped, the wind and rain started up again in a crescendo of maniacal drumming, pounding and wailing. That's when Fetch moved. Suddenly, with a whirring sound, Fetch's head raised. Then his gaping, tooth-filled mouth opened, and he growled. What the hell? Greg dropped Fetch on the counter and leapt back. Simultaneously, Cyril erupted from his chair. What? Hattie asked, returning to his friends. Greg pointed at Fetch, whose head and mouth were in clearly different positions than they had been when they found him. Sick, Hattie said. They all stared at Fetch, edging backward in an unspoken agreement that a little distance was a good idea in case Fetch did something else. They waited. So did Fetch. Hattie got bored first. He shined his flashlight in the direction of the stage. What do you think is behind that curtain? I think I don't want to know, Cyril said. Behind them, a door slammed, inside the building. As a unit, the boys ran through the dining room and down the hall to the storage room they'd broken into. Even though he was the smallest, Cyril reached the room first. He was out through the narrow gap they managed to create in the jammed service door opening before the other boys could squeeze through. Outside, pelted by rain streaking sideways, they grabbed their bikes. Greg figured the wind was gusting over 50 miles per hour now. No way could they bike home. He looked at Hattie, whose curly black hair was matted against his head. Hattie burst out laughing, and Greg joined in. Cyril hesitated, then started laughing too. "Come on!" Hattie shouted over the screaming wind. Without looking back at the restaurant, they put their heads down and pushed their bikes against the storm. As he trudged beside his friends, Greg thought about why he'd wanted them to come to this abandoned restaurant. They'd left so much of it unexplored. Like the area behind the curtain, there'd been 3 closed doors off the hallway too. What was behind them? Greg was afraid he might not have gotten what he was there for. Had he done what he was meant to do? Greg was close to home when a woman called out, "Wet enough for you?" He stopped, wiped his eyes, and squinted through the rain. "Hey, Mrs. Peters," he called when he saw his elderly neighbor standing on her covered front porch. She threw up her skinny arms. "Love these storms," she sang out. He laughed and waved at her. "Enjoy!" he shouted. She waved too, and he plodded on. When he neared his parents' tall, modern, oceanfront house, Greg was surprised to see a light in the living room window. The town was still dark. When he'd parted with Cyril and Hattie, the only lights he'd seen were their flashlights bobbing along like disembodied spirits, and the flickers of what looked like candles inside a couple houses. The light in his window, however, was bright and steady. When he pulled his bike in next to the stilts that raised the house a full story off the ground, he discovered why he'd seen light. At first, drowned out by the thunderous sounds of the wind and rain, he hadn't heard the motor until he practically walked into it. A shiny new generator sat under the house, chugging away, a cord extending past the 2-car garage and up the stairs to the front door. Greg peeled off his dripping rain jacket as he climbed the steps, but before he reached the front door, it opened. "There you are, boyo!" Greg's Uncle Darren grinned down at him, his mountainous 6'5" broad-shouldered frame filling the doorway. "I was about to mount a search pose. You didn't answer your phone." Greg reached the entry and exchanged his and his uncle's signature greeting, a half-hug, double fist bump. "Sorry, Dad, I didn't hear it." He pulled the phone from his pocket and tapped it. Dad had texted and called him multiple times. "Wow, I swear I didn't hear it." Who could hear anything in this wind? Get inside. "Where'd the generator come from?" Greg asked. He didn't really care. He was trying to distract himself from thinking about why he didn't hear his phone in the restaurant. It hadn't been that loud inside. Could it have been because... "I got it in Olympia. Your dad's been saying for years you don't need it. But that's bullhonky. I told him he's going to wish he had one. They've been saying the storms will be much worse this winter. And wouldn't you know it, they came early this year. How about that rain we got last week for Halloween?" Dad shook his head. "Of course, your dad won't listen." Greg didn't remember that argument. But then, Dad and Greg's dad had so many arguments. How could he remember any specific one? Uncle Darren was Greg's mother's brother, her only sibling, and they were close. Greg and Dad were even closer. But Greg's dad hated Dad for the very reasons Greg loved him. because Dare was flamboyant and fun. Darren needs to grow up, Greg's dad would say over and over, with long hair dyed purple and worn in a braid, and a wardrobe of bright-colored suits and ties paired with painfully patterned shirts. Dare had his own distinct look. That Dare was also a wealthy, successful inventor of car parts, and had the most amazing luck with investments, and money in general was the nail in the coffin as far as Greg's dad was concerned. People like him don't deserve success, he often groused. Greg's dad was a contractor, and he worked more than he wanted to afford their big house and the expensive cars he liked. The fact that Dad lived on a 10-acre estate and made tons of money from tinkering in his workshop was too much. Greg loved Dare the way he wished he could love his dad. Dare had done nothing but accept Greg from the day his squished little head entered the world, despite the fact that Greg was never a cute baby, and he hadn't turned into a cute kid. His face was too long, his eyes were too close together, and his nose was too small. He compensated for all that with long, wavy blonde hair, a great smile, or so a girl in his former 8th grade class had said, and enough height and muscle to think he might not be a total lost cause after high school. Never drawn to typical boy things like cars and sports, no matter how hard his dad tried to force them down his throat, Greg found an ally in Dare, who didn't question Greg's likes or dislikes. He accepted Greg as he was. "Where's Mom?" Greg asked Dare. "Book club." Greg didn't ask about his dad. 1, he didn't care. 2, he knew his dad would be playing poker with his buddies. That was how he spent his Saturday evenings, even if he had to play cards by candlelight. "Where were you boys in this weather?" Dare asked. Can I keep that a secret?" Dare tilted his huge head and stroked his graying goatee. "Sure, I trust you." "Thanks. You want to play backgammon?" Dare asked. "Can I take a rain check?" "Ha! Good one." Dare gestured to Greg's still dripping coat. Greg shook his head. "Unintentional. I just wanted to do some reading." "Sure, no prob. I just came by to set up the generator for you guys. When you went here and I couldn't get a hold of you, I figured I'd stay until Worry fried my circuits and maybe phone the police." Greg grinned. "I'm glad I made it home before you called the cops." "Me too." Dare started to reach for his magenta raincoat, then hesitated and snapped his fingers. "Oh, by the way, I heard you got your first babysitting gig. Glad you finally brought your old man around." "It was really thanks to you. Once you threw your 2 cents in, it was 3 against 1. I'm sitting for the McNally's kid next week. Jake? They need someone to watch him on Saturdays." "No way! His mom and I go way back. Maybe I'll stop by sometime. Bring you guys a treat. Or bring my new puppy. I've been thinking seriously about getting a dog." "Really? Cool! Yeah, a friend has a Shih Tzu that's going to have puppies soon. I'm thinking I've been without a dog long enough. I miss having a dog to cuddle with." Greg laughed. "Just be sure it's a nice Shih Tzu. I think the beast next door is part Shih Tzu." "That snaggletooth mongrel? Nah, no dog of mine will be like that. Remember," Dare said, holding up his right index finger, on which he wore his favorite onyx and gold ring. "I have the magic finger of luck," Dare and Greg said in unison. They laughed. The magic finger of luck had been an ongoing joke since Greg was about 4 years old. One day, Greg was crying because he wanted the stuffed octopus in a claw machine. He hadn't been able to get it when his mother put money in the machine, and he tried with the claw. Dare had tapped the glass of the claw machine with his right index finger and had said in a deep voice, "I have the magic finger of luck. I will get you the octopus." And he had done it on the first try. After that, Dare called on the magic finger of luck to get things to go his way. It pretty much always worked. Greg stopped laughing, thinking again about the neighbor's dog. Yeah, I still can't believe that thing bit me. The neighbors next door had moved in the year before, and 2 days later their dog, a small but evil mutt with very sharp teeth and one missing eye, charged out at Greg and bit him on the ankle. He had to have 10 stitches. Okay, I'll go and leave you to your reading, Dare said. Before I go though, let's make sure everything's working right. 15 minutes later, Greg was lounging on his double bed, reading by the nice bright light of his red pendant reading lamp. Dare had gotten the family a power transfer system for the generator that hooked up to the breaker box. With the flip of a few switches, power was restored to the whole house. Got this especially for your gaming needs, Dare said, before giving Greg another half-hug double fist bump and leaving. Even though he really wanted to get to his reading, Greg took the time to do his nightly yoga routine before sliding under the oversized afghan Dare had knitted for him. Dare had also taught him yoga, and Greg loved it. It not only calmed him down before bed, it helped him stay in shape. Not that good shape was good enough. Greg stood in front of the mirror and examined his narrow shoulders and slight chest. Even though he had muscles in his arms and legs, his torso was still too thin, and his face. Greg's phone buzzed. He picked it up and looked at a text from Hadi. "You recovered?" Greg snorted, as if he was scared enough to need recovering. "From what?" he texted back, playing dumb. "You can't fool me." "Okay," Greg responded. "Yeah, I'm good. Need more courage, I guess." "You need Brian Reinhardt's brain. He's not afraid of anything." Greg laughed. "Good point. Brian Reinhardt was the football team's star running back." He texted, "I could use his legs too. Fast for running." Lol. How about Steve Thornton's shoulders? Powerful enough to thump scary things. Greg laughed again, but Hadi was onto something. If Greg was going to do what he'd set out to do, why didn't he pick and choose what he wanted? "Okay," he typed in, "but I want Don Waring's chest too then." Greg grinned at the idea of constructing a body from a football player's parts. He needed a good face though, especially if he was going to get a girl to pay attention to him. "I want Ron Fisher's eyes," he texted. RGR. How about Neil Manning's nose? Greg smiled and typed, OBV. Mouth? Greg thought about it. He responded, Zax. BFG. Greg smiled. He could picture Hadi's big freaking grin. Hair? I like my own, Greg replied. Ego much? Greg laughed. GG. Greg typed in BFN. Greg flopped onto his bed. He picked up his journal and the book on the 0-point field he needed to check. He glanced over at his plants before he started reading. They were the key to this, weren't they? They made the exchange he just had with Hadi more than just a silly game. Well, they were at least a catalyst. Learning about Cleve Baxter's experiments is what had launched him down the road he was on. But the plants wouldn't help him tonight. He needed to review what he knew about random event generators, or REGs. He flipped through his book. Yes, there it was. Machines and Consciousness. Cause and Effect. He put the book down and skimmed his last journal entry. He hadn't misinterpreted what he'd gotten, had he? No, he didn't think so. He was either on the right track, or he wasn't. And if he wasn't, He didn't think he wanted to know what track he was on. The way he'd been drawn to that place couldn't have been a coincidence. The storm hung around another day, but it fizzled out late Sunday night. Power came back on. School was in session as usual Monday morning. Greg endured the first half of the day and was relieved when 1:10 p.m. finally rolled around and he got to go to Advanced Scientific Theory. Advanced Scientific Theory was an AP class reserved for freshmen who had won science fair prizes in the previous 2 years. The class had only 12 students. It was taught by a visiting teacher, Mr. Jacoby, who also taught at Grays Harbor Community College. As always, Greg was the first one in the classroom. He sat in the front. Only Hattie would sit near him. Mr. Jacoby was practically bouncing at the front of the yellow-walled classroom when the bell rang. Tall and lanky, but so full of energy, he reminded Greg of a long-coiled spring. Mr. Jacoby was an enthusiastic teacher who was undaunted by disinterested students. Greg loved science, all science, not just tech, and his passion had earned him the title of teacher's pet. Mr. Jacoby always lectured while darting around the front of the classroom like he had bugs in his pants. Sometimes he scribbled on the whiteboard. More often, he just rambled. But it was interesting stuff. This small room, filled with tall wooden lab tables and counter-height chairs, was one of Greg's favorite places in the school. He loved the periodic table and the constellation posters on the walls. He loved the smell of the fertilizer that fed the hybrid plants growing at the back of the room. It made him think of science and learning. Running a hand through unruly red hair, Mr. Jacoby began. In quantum physics, there is something known as the zero-point field. This field is scientific proof that there is no such thing as a vacuum, no such thing as nothingness. If you empty all space of matter and energy, you still find, in subatomic terms, a bunch of activity. This constant activity is a field of energy that is always in motion, subatomic matter constantly interacting with other subatomic matter. Mr. Jacoby rubbed a freckled nose. Are you all with me? Greg nodded enthusiastically. Hattie, who sat next to him at the three-person lab table, nudged him. Hey, this is your stick. Greg ignored him. Mr. Jacoby grinned at Greg and took his nod to represent the entire class, which was unwise, but Greg was fine with it. Good, Mr. Jacoby continued. So this energy is called the zero-point field because fluctuations in the field are still found in temperatures of absolute zero. Absolute zero is the lowest possible energy state, where everything has been removed and there should be nothing remaining to make any motion. Make sense? Greg nodded again. Great. So the energy should be zero, but when they measure the energy mathematically, it never actually reaches zero. There's always some remaining vibration due to continued particle exchange. Still with me? Greg nodded enthusiastically. He'd had no idea Mr. Jacoby was going to talk about this today. What were the odds? He grinned. There were no odds. It was the field. He was so excited that he missed the next few minutes of Mr. Jacoby's lecture. It didn't matter. He knew this stuff. He did tune back in, though, when Kimberly Bergstrom raised her hand. Well, he sort of tuned back in. He had her question, is this just theory? He also heard the start of Mr. Jacoby's answer. Not entirely. Consider the scientific trend. Before the scientific revolution, That's where Greg tuned out again. He got caught up in watching Kimberly. Who wouldn't? Long, inky black hair, amazing green eyes, prettier than any model Greg had ever seen. Greg felt himself flush, and he whipped his gaze away from Kimberly before someone caught him staring. Too late. Hattie nudged him again, and when Greg looked over, Hattie made goofy goo-goo eyes at him. Greg shifted his attention back to Mr. Jacoby. As usual, Greg was the last one out of the room when class was over. Mr. Jacoby smiled at him as Greg gathered his stuff, and Greg gave another thought to talking to his teacher. Then he felt his phone vibrate. Waving at Miss Jacoby, Greg pulled out his phone as he stepped into the hallway. He looked at the screen. Hello, Greg. HRU. The phone number wasn't familiar. Greg looked around. Who is texting him? He entered. I'm fine. Who is this? Then he watched his screen. Fetch! Oh, very funny, Hattie, Greg muttered. He texted what he said. The reply wasn't what he expected. Question for you. What's your question? Greg texted. Why'd you leave? Greg rolled his eyes and entered. You're hilarious. T.Y. You answer. Greg felt a tap on the shoulder. You're going to be late for Spanish, amigo, Hattie said. Greg whipped around. Hattie raised an eyebrow. And Cyril, who stood next to him, took a step back. Why are you texting me if you're right here? Greg asked Hattie. Dude, you whacked? Do I look like I'm texting you? Actually, no. Hattie's phone was nowhere in sight. Greg looked back at his phone. Whoever was texting him had it repeated. You answer. Greg looked at Cyril. Did you text me? No. Porque habría. I don't know why you text me, and stop speaking in Spanish, Greg said. Cyril ignored him. Venga. He tugged on Greg's sleeve. I hate Spanish, Greg said. Cyril looked past Greg and said, Hola, Manuel. Greg turned to look at Manuel Gomez, who had transferred into the school a couple weeks before from Myriad, Spain. Hola, Cyril. ¿Cómo estás? Estoy bien. ¿Tú? Bueno. Hoy, Manuel conoces a Greg? Cyril asked, gesturing at Greg. No. Manuel smiled at Greg and held out his hand. Encantada de concerta? He just said, nice to meet you, Cyril told Greg. Lo sé, Greg said. I'm not a total Spanish spaz. Close enough, Cyril said. Manuel laughed. Greg tiene muchos problemas con el español? Cyril told Manuel. I'd be happy to help you with Spanish any time, Manuel said to Greg. Want me to give you my number? He held up his phone. Sure. Greg swapped phones with Manuel, and they exchanged numbers. Yo, Mousy, someone called out to Cyril. How's your mom doing? She's still a freak like you? Greg turned and faced Cyril's bully. He cleared his throat and said loudly, Remember this, Trent. 3 things in life are important. The first is to be kind. The second is to be kind. And the third is to be kind. So said Henry James. Trent shoved Greg. You're a freak. As Trent sauntered away, Hardy nudged Greg. You read too much. You don't read enough. In unison, they said in exaggerated deep voices, The universe in balance. They bumped fists and finished with, Cha! A couple of kids in the hall deliberately jostled Greg, and one of them said, You guys are weird. And proud of it, Greg sang. Hattie shook his head. Manuel touched Greg's shoulder. I like Henry James too. He grinned and held out a fist. Greg bumped fists with Manuel. Then, shoving his phone in his pocket, Greg followed Cyril and Hattie to Spanish. He wasn't going to talk to them about the texts now, but he didn't stop thinking about the texts either. If neither Hattie nor Cyril sent them, who did? Was someone else in the restaurant with the boys on Saturday night? Is that what that slamming door was? Or did someone see them leave, then go in and find Fetch? The idea that they'd been watched made Greg's skin crawl. But the idea that they hadn't been watched made all the hair stand up on Greg's arms. Could it be? He wouldn't think about it. Not yet. By the next day, he was thinking about it. Hard. In that time, he'd received 12 texts from Fetch. By now, he realized the texts had to be from the animatronic. They couldn't be from anyone else, because no one else could know everything Fetch was texting about. Obviously, Fetch was dialed into Greg, so to speak. It quickly became clear that Fetch was synced with Greg's phone, and he was trying to live up to his name. When Greg told Cyril he needed more time to do some homework, Fetch sent Greg a link to a time management article, and a clock app appeared on Greg's phone. When Greg looked up REGs online, he received a link from Fetch to an article about the latest research into intention and REGs. When Greg finished the article, Fetch texted 0100 1111 011 01011 011 00001 01111 001 00111 This baffled Greg until he thought about the article he just read. The article talked about the experiments being done that used REGs to measure whether a person could think hard enough to have an effect on an outcome in the physical world. Greg knew REGs generated random ones and zeros. Ones and zeros, Greg thought. Was it possible? Greg copied Fetch's text into a binary-to-text converter, and sure enough, Fetch had texted, "Okay," in binary code. Greg shivered as he texted back, "Okay." He wasn't sure it was okay at all. It was more spooky than okay. Then things got stranger, as if getting texts from an old animatronic dog wasn't bizarre to begin with. One day, Greg told his mom on the phone that he was craving chocolate. She said what she always said when he mentioned candy. "Not good for you. Have an apple." Later that day, when she got home from shopping, she pulled a chocolate bar out of the bag. "How'd this get here?" she said in annoyance, tucking her chin-length blonde hair behind an ear. "I didn't buy this." She checked her receipt and discovered the bar was on the order she'd placed online. "Must be a glitch," she said. "I'll have to email them." When she caught Greg watching her, she said, "Well, it's your lucky day," and tossed him the bar. As he caught the candy bar, he was pretty sure he couldn't eat it yet. He was too excited. If he was right, Fetch had just fetched him a candy bar. What else could the animatronic dog do? And how was he doing it? Greg could accept, barely, that Fetch was synced with his phone. But Fetch wasn't synced with his mom's phone, was he? The text messages continued day after day. Sometimes Greg responded just because. Sometimes not. Either way, he kept a log in his journal. This was giving him important feedback for his project. A lot of his exchanges with Fetch made no sense. Like the day Fetch texted, DDAS, "Why would I do anything stupid?" Greg responded, "Dunno." Sometimes the texts were clear. One day, Greg texted Cyril that he was having trouble with the Spanish homework, and he needed the translation for "I don't know how to make banana bread without eggs or flour." Cyril didn't respond, but Fetch texted, "No sé cómo hacer pan de plátano sin huevos ni harina." Cyril didn't text back until late in the evening. When he did, his translation was the same as Fetch's. Was it time for Greg to tell his friends what was going on? He decided to wait. But then came the spider. On Saturday, a couple weeks before Christmas, Greg was home taking care of Jake, his now usual Saturday babysitting gig. Dare, or Uncle Dare, to both Greg and Jake, thanks to Dare's close friendship with Mrs. McNally, had suggested he come over with a rainy day picnic, complete with a yellow smiley face picnic blanket, some spotted plants, rubber toy insects, and a wicker basket full of creative sandwiches like artichoke salad with provolone and raisins on pumpernickel and chicken and peanut butter on rye. Fortunately, Dare knew Greg wasn't as adventurous with food as he was, so he included a couple of ordinary tuna salad sandwiches too. They set up that picnic in the living room, in front of the big picture window overlooking the dunes and the ocean. You could barely see the ocean through the rain. One shade of gray merged with the next. Jake, 4 years old, loved the picnic, but he wasn't keen on the huge rubber spider that lurked near the edge of the picnic blanket. He was so agitated that Greg suggested they put the picnic on hold. He got out 2 spatulas and made a big production of scooping up the spider and putting it in a sealed plastic bag. That wasn't enough for Jake. "Out!" he demanded, pointing a chubby finger toward the door. So Greg put on his rain jacket and went out in the rain, while Dare and Jake supervised from under the shelter of the house. Greg dug a hole in the mud and buried the rubber spider. Satisfied, Jake ate the rest of his picnic lunch without comment. "Good job, boyo," Dare said. Greg enjoyed the praise. He sure never got any from his dad, who, as usual, was working. When Dare was around, though, he didn't seem to mind his father's disapproval as much. His uncle made everything seem better. A couple days before Christmas, Greg and Hattie were talking on the phone about Trent. "He's such a jerk," Greg said. He laid on his bed, watching his plants, sending specific thoughts to them like one might send to an IEG. Just like in Cleve Baxter's experiments, his plants seemed to be responding well to his latest intentions. "I don't really pay attention to him," Hattie said, "but I know he freaks out Cyril." "Yeah, he needs to be pranked," Hattie said. "I was thinking spiders. I overheard him the other day telling Zach he's afraid of spiders." Greg laughed. "Seriously? I've got a rubber one buried in my backyard. Maybe if the rain stops, I'll dig it up before I come over." "Yeah, do that. Ho ho ho. It'd make a nice surprise in his stocking." Greg waited a few hours, but the rain didn't let up. It thrummed relentlessly on the roof. If Greg hadn't promised Hattie he'd go over to wrap presents, he wouldn't have left the house. But he promised, so he geared up for the rain and stepped outside. He almost screamed when he looked down and saw a huge spider covering the well of welcome friends on his mother's jute doormat. Jumping back, he stared at the spider, realizing now what it was. Greg felt his pulse accelerate. This was not possible. But there it was. It was the rubber spider he'd buried, still in its now muddy plastic bag. No one except Dare and Jake knew where that spider was. Jake and his family had gone to Hawaii for Christmas, and Dare was on a ski trip with friends. "Wish you could be here for our white Christmas, boyo," Dare had said on the phone the night before. Leaning over and picking up the plastic bag by the corner, as if it was a deadly creature in and of itself, Greg held the bag in front of his face. Were those teeth marks along the bottom edge? He dropped the bag. His phone buzzed. He sucked in his breath and fumbled for his phone. "Merry Xmas." "Merry Christmas to you too, Fetch," Greg entered, while trying to ignore the fact that his fingers were trembling. He didn't wait for a reply. Ignoring the urge to throw the phone into the shrubs at the edge of his yard, he shoved it back in his pocket. It was time. He had to talk to his friends. The day after Christmas, the boys gathered in Greg's room, on the bed. Greg sat with his back against the navy blue cushioned headboard. His friends sprawled next to each other, at the foot. He glanced around the room, taking comfort in his familiar surroundings. Posters of movie musicals alternated with puppy posters on the walls, and 2 shelving units stuffed with books flanked the window that looked out toward the ocean. The sky outside was matte gray, as if an artist with no sense of depth had just slathered paint across the horizon. On the wall opposite the window, his plants sat in rows on shelving under a low-hanging bank of grow lights. His antique roll-top desk, a gift from Dad, sat next to the door. A plate of gingerbread cookies Greg had baked 2 days before sat in the middle of the bed. Grabbing a cookie, Hattie asked, "What's this urgent meeting about?" "Yeah," Cyril squeaked. "I was going to go to the day after Christmas sales with my mom." Hattie shook his head. "Seriously, dude? Do you listen to yourself? You might as well wear a t-shirt that says, 'Make fun of me.'" Greg threw a dirty sock at Hattie. "Leave him alone. If he likes to shop with his mom, he likes to shop with his mom." Hattie gave Greg a mock bow. "You make a point." He nodded towards Cyril, this time for real. "Sorry. "'S-okay." In the silence that followed, Greg weighed how he was going to explain everything. Well, maybe he wasn't going to explain everything. Maybe just some things. For sure, he had to tell them about Fetch. He looked over to his nightstand, which held stacks of books, papers, and his phone, still receiving texts from Fetch. His most recent, an hour before Cyril and Hattie showed up, was, "Do you need food for meeting?" "No, thank you," Greg texted back. He took a deep breath and wrinkled his nose at the scent of the lavender air freshener his mother had put someplace in his room. He'd been looking for it, but hadn't found it yet. He preferred the smell of his sweaty clothes, thank you very much. "Okay, so there's no way to say this but to say it," he began. Hattie and Cyril looked at him. "Fetch has been sending me texts." His friends stared at him. They blinked in unison. "Who's Fetch?" Hattie asked. "Wait, you mean that dog thing? That prize from the pizzeria? Is this a joke?" Cyril asked. Greg shook his head. He picked up one of the stacks of papers from his nightstand, all the text messages he'd printed out, and held it out to Cyril. Look! He waited while Cyril and Hattie scooted together so they could read the text at the same time. This can't be real, Cyril said. His voice was even higher than normal. Hattie grabbed the stack of printouts and flipped through them. He glanced at Greg, then said to Cyril, "You wouldn't prank us like that." "No, I wouldn't," Greg said. "Want to see my phone? I'm smart, but I'm not smart enough to spoof texts on my phone." Hattie shook his head. He abruptly stood and started pacing in a tiny circle on Greg's blue and maroon braided rug. "It must have synced with your phone, dude," Hattie said finally. Greg nodded. "Yeah, except—" "Whoa, wait," Cyril said. "I'm not a techie, but I don't see how something as old as that animatronic dog could sync up with a modern smartphone. That's just not possible." "Obviously it is, though," Hattie said. "It's not just syncing." Greg reached for the muddy plastic bag containing the spider and held it up. He felt like he should say, "Exhibit A," but didn't. "What's that?" Cyril shifted away so fast he fell off the bed with a thud. Greg suppressed a laugh while Cyril jumped up. "Sorry," Greg said. "It's not real." He told them the story of the picnic and then the appearance of the unearthed bag on his doorstep. Cyril gaped at him, then looked from Hattie to Greg and back to Hattie. "No way!" "Let me see that." Hattie snatched the bag from Greg's grasp and examined it. "Those are teeth marks." "No way," Cyril repeated. "Way," Hattie said. "It's like my plants, I think," Greg began. It was time to share what he was sure was behind all this. Hattie and Cyril stared at him. "What?" Hattie asked. "Have you heard of Cleve Baxter?" Greg asked. Pretty sure they hadn't. They shook their heads. "He was a polygraph expert who started doing experiments with plants in the 1960s. "Okay," Hattie said. "So what?" "So, in the 1960s, Baxter had the idea to hook up a plant to a polygraph machine to see if he could measure how long osmosis took. Although he didn't learn a thing about osmosis, he stumbled upon something else, something super cool." Greg stopped. Cyril and Hattie were still staring at the spider in the bag. They probably weren't even listening to him, and even if they were, Greg realized there was no way he was ready to tell them. They probably weren't even listening to him, and even if they were, there was no way he was ready to tell them his theory. "What if someone was in the building with us, and now they're watching you?" Cyril asked, confirming that he and Hattie hadn't been listening. "What, like a stalker?" Hattie asked. "And he bugged my phone or something?" Greg asked. "That's just crazy." But was it any crazier than what he thought was going on? Greg's phone buzzed. He picked it up and read the incoming texts. He dropped the phone on the bed. Hattie and Cyril looked from the phone to Greg. He pointed at it. When they leaned over to look at it, he looked too and read the text again. "L." "What's L?" Cyril asked. Hattie went pale. He met Greg's wide-eyed gaze. "Evil laugh," they said in unison. An animatronic dog that wanted to be helpful was one thing. An animatronic dog that wanted to be helpful and had a sense of humor was okay. But an animatronic dog who had an agenda, that was well, scary. After all, Greg stopped trying to get Hattie and Cyril to understand what he thought was going on with Fetch. So when they finished freaking out about Fetch's text, he told them he'd keep them posted and decided it was time to conduct more experiments. Going to the abandoned restaurant in itself had been a test, and he still wasn't sure how that had turned out. It had started with him putting an intention out, a desire backed by his will. It had started with him putting an intention out, a desire backed by his will, that had led to an impulse to act. The impulse had taken him to the restaurant, where he found Fetch. But how did Fetch play into the grand scheme of things? He had to figure it out. He decided to start with something small and specific. The next day, he got his first experiment's result. An advanced scientific theory, Miss Jacoby, looking even more nerdy than usual in a blue-checked, short-sleeved shirt under a red and blue argyle sweater vest, started his lecture with, "So now that we understand the zero-point field, let's see if we can figure out what it means for the real world."